the borehole that recorded screams from hell. In 1989, a story began circulating through Christian newsletters, evangelical radio programs, and missionary networks claiming that Soviet scientists drilling the Kola Super Deep borehole, a real scientific project that had penetrated deeper into Earth's crust than any previous drilling operation, reaching depths of over 12 kilometers, had broken through into a massive underground cavity, and upon lowering temperature-resistant microphones into the opening, had recorded sounds that could only be described as millions of human voices screaming in agony. The unmistakable sounds of souls suffering in hell. The scientists, according to the story, were atheist communists who didn't believe in God or the afterlife, but the audio they captured was so disturbing, so clearly the screams of the damned, that some of them fled the project in terror, unable to reconcile what they'd heard with their materialist worldview, unable to deny that they had accidentally drilled into the actual underworld, into the biblical hell where condemned souls suffer eternal torment, and that their instruments had recorded proof that the ancient religious texts were literally true, that beneath our feet, just 12 kilometers down through the Earth's crust, the domain of Satan and the suffering dead actually exists not as metaphor or spiritual realm, but as physical location accessible through sufficiently deep excavation. The story included details that gave it credibility: the specific location in Russia's Kola Peninsula, the depth of 12 kilometers, which matched real data from the actual borehole project. Quotes attributed to Dr. Azakov, the alleged chief scientist who reportedly said the project was terminated because what they discovered was too terrifying to continue investigating. And most compellingly, the claimed audio recording itself, which circulated on cassette tapes and later online. Several seconds of chaotic screaming and wailing that sounded like thousands of voices in torment, allegedly captured by scientific instruments deployed into the cavity they'd breached. The story spread rapidly through Christian communities, appearing in magazines and newsletters, being repeated from pulpits, shared as testimony to the reality of hell and the truth of Scripture, becoming so widespread that it was treated as established fact by significant portions of evangelical Christianity, despite immediately raising questions about its authenticity, despite the obvious problems with the narrative, despite the lack of verification from any legitimate news sources or scientific institutions, despite eventually being thoroughly debunked as hoax, as deliberate fabrication created by combining real details about the Kola borehole with fictional elements and manufactured audio, yet persisting decades later in conspiracy theory communities and fundamentalist circles, where it continues to be cited as evidence that hell is real and located in the Earth's interior, and that scientists accidentally proved this in 1989 before suppressing the discovery, making the sounds from hell one of the most successful religious urban legends of modern times. A story that either documents the most significant theological and scientific discovery in human history, or documents how easily fabricated stories can spread when they tell people what they want to believe, when they confirm existing religious convictions about the reality of hell and divine judgment, leaving the well-to-hell story hovering between testified to fact and demonstrated hoax, between evidence of literal hell and evidence of human gullibility, between proof that spiritual realms have physical locations and proof that conspiracy theories and religious legends can survive debunking indefinitely if the audience has sufficient motivation to believe them. The Kola Super Deep borehole is real. It exists on the Kola Peninsula in northwestern Russia, was drilled between 1970 and 1994 as scientific research project studying the Earth's crust, and reached a depth of 12,262 meters, making it the deepest artificial point on Earth until exceeded by oil wells, using different drilling techniques in later decades. The project was legitimate science, investigating deep geology, testing theories about crustal composition, studying seismic discontinuities, and gathering data about Earth's interior that couldn't be obtained through surface observation. The borehole hit unexpectedly high temperatures at depth, over 180 degrees Celsius at 12 kilometers, which exceeded predictions and eventually made further drilling impractical because conventional drill bits couldn't function in those conditions. The project was closed in 1994 for economic and technical reasons following the Soviet Union's collapse, not because they discovered hell. The Well to Hell story appears to have originated with a Finnish Christian newsletter in 1989, which published an article claiming the discovery had occurred and that scientists had been terrified by what they found. The story was then picked up by Trinity Broadcasting Network in the United States, where it was broadcast on Christian television and spread rapidly through evangelical communities. The supposed scientist, Dr. Azakoff, appears to be fictional. No records of a geologist or seismologist by that name associated with the Kola project exist. The quotes attributed to him have never been verified in any Soviet scientific publication or documentation from the actual project. The audio recording that supposedly captures the screams from hell has been analyzed and appears to be fabricated from multiple sources. Audio forensics suggests it's a composite of horror movie sound effects, manipulated recordings of crowds, and possibly animal sounds processed to sound human-like, layered together to create chaotic screaming that doesn't have the acoustic characteristics of sound recorded in the specific environmental conditions that would exist in a deep borehole. The recording also doesn't match what would be captured by the temperature-resistant microphones that would have been used in actual deep Earth research. Such equipment would produce very different audio quality and frequency response than what appears in the circulated recording. The physics of the claimed discovery are problematic. Sound requires a medium to travel, typically air, and the cavity described in the story would need to be enormous and filled with air at depth, which is geologically implausible. The temperatures and pressures at 12 kilometers depth would make any air-filled cavity impossible to maintain, and any sounds generated at that depth would be transmitted through rock as seismic waves rather than as airborne audio that could be recorded by conventional microphones. The entire scenario is incompatible with what we know about Earth's interior structure and the physical behavior of sound. The theological implications of the story are also problematic from within Christian frameworks. Biblical descriptions of hell typically don't locate it as physical cavity in Earth's crust, but rather as spiritual realm or as metaphorical description of separation from God. Most theological traditions understand hell as existing outside physical space-time rather than as accessible through geological drilling. The story's literal interpretation, hell as physical location 12 kilometers below surface, represents folk theology rather than scholarly religious understanding, appealing to fundamentalist literalism that reads scriptural metaphors as physical descriptions. Yet the story persists. Decades after being debunked, after the fabrication has been documented, after the audio has been shown to be fake and the scientists shown to be fictional, and the entire narrative demonstrated to be hoax, the Well to Hell story continues to circulate. It appears in conspiracy theory compilations, gets shared on social media, is presented in fundamentalist Christian contexts as evidence of hell's reality, is cited by people who either don't know it's been debunked or who reject the debunking as part of atheist or scientific conspiracy to suppress evidence of the spiritual realm. This persistence reveals something about how belief systems interact with information. For people whose religious identity and worldview depend on hell being literally real, a story claiming scientific proof of hell's existence is powerfully attractive, confirms what they already believe, provides evidence they can cite when challenged by skeptics. Once accepted into their belief system, the story becomes resistant to correction because rejecting it would require acknowledging they were fooled. would weaken their ability to argue for their religious positions, would remove a piece of evidence they've been using to support their faith. The mechanism of debunking resistance involves motivated reasoning and source credibility judgments. If someone believes the story is true and it's important to their worldview, they're motivated to find reasons to reject debunking attempts. They can question the credibility of skeptical sources. Scientists and fact-checkers might be lying to suppress religious truth. They can argue that absence of verification doesn't prove the story is false. Records might have been destroyed or suppressed. The scientist might have used a pseudonym for safety. The audio might be authentic even if its provenance can't be established. As long as the story can't be definitively disproven to their satisfaction, and what would constitute definitive disproof to someone sufficiently motivated to believe, they can continue accepting it. The Well to Hell story also functions as modern folklore, as urban legend that serves cultural purposes beyond its truth value. It expresses anxiety about scientific materialism, about the erosion of religious certainty in modern secular societies, about the fear that science is trying to eliminate God and the spiritual realm from human understanding. The story pushes back against this, suggests that even atheist scientists conducting secular research can't escape divine reality, that hell exists whether they believe in it or not, that their instruments will record spiritual truth even when their minds refuse to acknowledge it. It's revenge fantasy for religious believers who feel marginalized by scientific authority. A story where the scientists are forced to confront that they were wrong, that the religious were right all along, that reality includes the spiritual dimensions that materialism denies. The comparison to other false stories that persist despite debunking is instructive. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion continues to circulate despite being proven fabricated anti-Semitic propaganda. Moon landing denial persists despite overwhelming evidence the landings occurred. Flat Earth belief exists despite trivial ability to demonstrate Earth's sphericity. In each case, the false narrative serves psychological or ideological needs for believers that truth-based correction can't address. The Well to Hell story similarly serves needs: validation of religious belief, confirmation of hell's reality, evidence to use in evangelism, that make it valuable regardless of its factual status. The ethical dimension involves whether sharing known false stories is justified if it serves religious purposes. Some who spread the Well to Hell story know it's fabricated, but argue that if it brings people to faith, if it makes hell's reality vivid and motivates repentance, then the deception is justified as noble lie, as tool for achieving greater spiritual truth, even through factual falsehood. Others argue this is deeply problematic, that faith built on false testimony is compromised, that when the falsehood is revealed, it undermines credibility of religious claims generally, that truth matters intrinsically, and using lies to promote religious belief is self-defeating and ethically wrong. The original fabricator's motives remain unclear. Was it deliberate hoax intended to fool credulous believers, prank, or social experiment to see how quickly false story would spread through religious communities? Was it sincere but mistaken belief by someone who combined fragmentary information about the Kola Project with religious imagination, creating story they believed might be true and sharing it without adequate verification? Was it evangelical tool, fabrication intended to serve faith by making hell vivid and real to audiences that might be wavering in belief? The anonymity of early internet and newsletter distribution means the original source can't be identified and interviewed to determine intent. The lesson extends beyond this specific hoax to questions about how we evaluate extraordinary claims. The Well to Hell story contained verifiable elements. The Kola borehole existed, reached the claimed depth, was Soviet scientific project, mixed with unverifiable elements, the cavity, the recording, the scientist's quotes, the project cancellation reason. This mixing of real and false details is characteristic of successful hoaxes, making the story seem plausible enough to avoid immediate dismissal, while the unverifiable elements carry the actual extraordinary claims. Effective fact-checking requires not just verifying that some details are accurate, but checking whether the extraordinary claims specifically are supported by credible evidence, which in this case they weren't. The scientific response to the story has been consistent dismissal. Geologists and seismologists have repeatedly explained why the claimed discovery is physically impossible, why the audio couldn't be authentic, why the scenario violates known facts about Earth's interior. But scientific authority doesn't persuade audiences that distrust science or that believe scientists are part of atheist conspiracy to suppress religious truth. The expertise that makes scientists credible sources on geological questions is exactly what makes them suspect sources for believers who think scientific materialism is fundamentally wrong about spiritual reality. Whether hell exists as spiritual reality, as state of separation from God, as metaphorical description of suffering, or doesn't exist at all, the Well to Hell story doesn't provide evidence for any of these positions because the story itself is fabricated, the audio is fake, the scientist is fictional, and the claimed events didn't occur. The Kola Super Deep borehole is impressive engineering and valuable science, but it didn't drill into hell because hell as physical cavity in Earth's crust doesn't exist. Because screams don't travel through rock at 12-kilometer depths in ways that could be recorded by microphones. Because the temperature and pressure conditions make the entire scenario impossible, leaving the Well to Hell as what it is. Successful religious hoax that continues circulating decades after debunking because it tells story that significant audience wants to believe, that confirms their religious worldview, that provides them with narrative and evidence they find useful despite its falsity, making it case study in how misinformation persists, not through lack of debunking, but through motivated belief, through audience that needs the story to be true more than they need truth, through communities that value the story's religious utility over its factual accuracy, leaving the Well to Hell story permanently circulating through fundamentalist Christianity and conspiracy theory networks, where it will continue appearing as testimony, as evidence, as proof of hell's reality. Despite being none of those things, despite being demonstrated fabrication, despite the Kola borehole, scientists never recording screams, never breaking into cavity, never fleeing in terror from proof of hell, because none of that happened. Because the story is false. Because the sounds from hell were created in recording studio or assembled from sound effects library, not captured by instruments deployed into Earth's crust, not transmitted from suffering souls, not evidence of anything except human capacity to create and spread false stories when those stories serve psychological or religious purposes that make truth secondary to utility, leaving the Well to Hell hovering as it always has between repeated claim and demonstrated falsehood, between testimonial and hoax, between evidence believers. Sight and fabrication skeptics document existing in permanent tension between communities that need it to be true and research that proves it isn't, between faith that wants scientific confirmation and science that doesn't provide it, between the story and the reality, between the claimed recording of screams from hell and the actual silence of the Kola Super Deep borehole that penetrated 12 kilometers into Earth's crust and found not souls in torment, but only rock and heat, and the geological processes that our planet has conducted for billions of years without supernatural intervention, without spiritual realms accessible through drilling, without hell waiting in the depths to be discovered by Soviet scientists, leaving only the borehole itself as monument to human engineering and scientific curiosity, and the story of screams from hell as monument to human credulity, and religious imagination, to our capacity to create legends that outlive debunking, that persist through sheer determination of belief, that continue spreading despite being false because they serve purposes that don't require truth, that exist in spaces where factual accuracy matters less than psychological utility, where stories function regardless of whether they describe actual events, where the well to hell remains eternally both claimed and disproven, both testified to and debunked, both evidence and fabrication, depending on who's telling it, who's listening, and whether truth or belief matters more in that particular moment, that particular community, that particular conversation about whether hell is real and whether science proved it in 1989, when Soviet scientists allegedly drilled too deep and heard the screams that confirmed ancient religious truth, or heard nothing except the natural processes of Earth's interior. Because the story never happened, was always false, remains demonstrably fabricated, yet continues its own form of eternal persistence, not in hell, but in the infinite circulation of internet and belief, where false stories never quite die, never quite get fully rejected, always find new audiences who haven't heard the debunking or who choose not to accept it, keeping the well-to-hell story alive decades after its creation, decades after its refutation, permanently suspended between claim and fact, between testimony and hoax, between the recording that supposedly captured hell and the silence that actually exists 12 kilometers beneath. The surface where the Kola borehole reached and where scientists found exactly what geology predicted, and nothing that scripture claimed, nothing supernatural, nothing spiritual, nothing that would support the story that nonetheless continues spreading, continues being believed, continues functioning as modern legend regardless of its relationship to truth. SCP Foundation, is it fiction or disclosure through entertainment? The SCP Foundation presents itself as collaborative creative writing, a massive online fiction project where thousands of contributors create documentation-style entries describing anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena that a shadowy organization called the Secure, Contain, Protect Foundation allegedly monitors and contains to prevent reality-altering threats from destroying or fundamentally changing the world. The writing style mimics redacted government documents, uses clinical language to describe impossible things, presents elaborate containment procedures for entities ranging from sentient sculptures to interdimensional horrors, and has created a universe of such depth and consistency that it functions as alternate reality documentation, as if the files are real and the fiction is simply the disclaimer that allows them to be published. The question that troubles some readers, and that conspiracy theorists have embraced, is whether this collaborative fiction might actually be something else. Whether the SCP Foundation exists in reality, and the fiction label is the mechanism by which actual anomalous phenomena can be disclosed publicly without causing panic or violation of classification. Whether the thousands of entries describing impossible objects and creatures are actually based on real files that have been slightly modified and released into the Creative Commons as entertainment, when they're actually soft disclosure, preparing humanity to accept that anomalies exist, that reality is far stranger than consensus understanding allows, and that somewhere, someone is actively working to contain and study the things that violate every rule we thought governed existence. The SCP format is distinctive: clinical containment procedures, object class designations indicating threat level and containment difficulty, descriptions that read like scientific documentation of the impossible, addenda containing incident reports, or research notes, or interview transcripts. The writing quality varies because thousands of authors contribute, but the best entries achieve remarkable verisimilitude, creating the sense that you're reading leaked classified documents, that the information you're accessing was never meant for public consumption, that you've stumbled into something real masquerading as fiction. This documentary style, this mimicry of government bureaucratic language applied to describing entities that shouldn't exist, creates cognitive dissonance that's both unsettling and compelling, making readers wonder if perhaps the line between fiction and reality is more permeable than they assumed. The theory that SCP represents disclosure through entertainment proposes several mechanisms. The most straightforward is that government agencies or private organizations that actually deal with anomalous phenomena use the SCP platform to release sanitized versions of real files, changing enough details to maintain plausible deniability while getting the core information into public awareness. This would serve multiple purposes. It desensitizes populations to concepts that would be shocking if revealed as fact. It creates a context where discussion of anomalies happens within a fiction framework that prevents panic, and it potentially crowdsources solutions or ideas by exposing the problems to thousands of creative minds who might suggest containment approaches or research avenues that actual researchers hadn't considered. The timing of SCP's emergence is noted by conspiracy theorists. The Wiki was founded in 2008, a period that saw increased discussion of government secrets following WikiLeaks releases, increased awareness of surveillance following Snowden revelations, and growing internet culture around collaborative world-building and alternate reality games. If disclosure was deemed necessary or inevitable, fictional frameworks that could absorb factual information while maintaining deniability would be valuable. SCP provides exactly such a framework. Anything can be added to the database, any anomaly can be described, and all of it is officially fiction, is clearly labeled as creative writing, is legally protected under that designation, even if some entries are actually describing real phenomena. The consistency of certain themes across SCP entries might suggest underlying truth rather than just convergent imagination. Entries frequently involve reality bending, dimensional anomalies, entities that violate physics, objects whose existence requires reconceptualizing fundamental assumptions about how reality works. If these themes appear repeatedly across thousands of independent authors, it could indicate either that humans share common anxieties and fascinations that manifest in similar fictional creations, or that authors are drawing on real information that's entered cultural consciousness through various disclosure vectors, creating fiction that unknowingly mirrors actual classified knowledge. The most famous SCP entries have achieved cultural penetration beyond the Wiki, inspiring video games, stories, artwork, and becoming recognizable even to people who don't actively follow the project. SCP-173, the statue that moves when not observed, is iconic. SCP-682, the indestructible reptile that adapts to any attempt to destroy it, has spawned endless discussions and derivative works. If these are based on real anomalous entities or objects, their popularization through fiction serves the dual purpose of disclosure and desensitization, making the actual existence of such things less shocking if they're ever officially acknowledged because people have already encountered the concepts in entertainment contexts. The containment procedures described in SCP entries, while often elaborate to the point of absurdity, sometimes include elements that seem oddly specific or technically sophisticated, suggesting either authors with deep knowledge of actual security protocols or authors who are describing procedures that actually exist for containing real anomalies. The bureaucratic detail, the consideration of edge cases, the multiple levels of redundancy. These characteristics match how actual high-security facilities and hazardous materials handling work, suggesting that whoever writes the best SCP entries either has intimate knowledge of such systems or is adapting actual containment protocols for fictional anomalies. The psychological impact of certain SCP entries also suggests either extremely skilled horror writing or descriptions of genuinely disturbing phenomena that have been slightly fictionalized. Entries that produce lasting unease, that create sense of existential dread, or that touch on concepts that feel true even though they shouldn't, might be resonating because they're closer to reality than readers consciously recognize. The human mind can sense truth even when it's presented in fictional context, can respond to information at levels below conscious awareness, can know that something is real even when it's labeled as imaginary. The argument against SCP being disclosure relies heavily on the sheer volume and diversity of the content. There are thousands of entries describing incompatible anomalies, contradictory physics, entities that couldn't coexist in the same universe. If they're all disclosure of real phenomena, reality would have to be far more fractured and inconsistent than even the most open-minded person could accept. The rational conclusion is that the overwhelming majority is fiction, creative writing by talented amateurs and professionals, world building that has achieved remarkable coherence through collaborative effort and editorial standards that maintain quality and consistency. But this doesn't preclude the possibility that some entries, a small percentage, might be based on or directly copied from actual classified material. In an ocean of fiction, real disclosure could hide effectively, indistinguishable from the creative work surrounding it, protected by the overall fictional nature of the platform. An intelligence agency wanting to release information without violating classification could simply add it to SCP and let it blend with the thousands of other entries, knowing that even if someone recognized it as potentially real, they'd have no way to prove it and would be dismissed as overthinking fiction or falling prey to conspiracy thinking. The concept of memetic hazards in SCP lore, information that harms or alters those who perceive it, is particularly interesting from a disclosure perspective. If certain knowledge actually is dangerous, if some information genuinely affects consciousness or reality in ways that make it hazardous to know, then documenting such phenomena, even in fictional form, might serve as a warning or preparation, might help people understand that not all information is safe to access, that some truths are dangerous in ways beyond social or political consequences. Whether SCP's memetic hazards are purely fictional constructs, or whether they're describing real properties of certain information, remains impossible to determine. But the concept itself introduces ideas about information as substance, as having properties beyond meaning, that align with esoteric traditions and with some interpretations of quantum information theory. The SCP community's sophistication and self-awareness complicates the disclosure theory. Contributors know about the theory that SCP might be disclosure, have written metafictional entries exploring the idea that the fiction might be real, have incorporated this possibility into the narrative framework in ways that make it part of the fiction. This reflexive quality means that even the disclosure theory has been absorbed into the fictional universe, making it impossible to separate whether people are speculating about real disclosure or whether they're simply adding another layer to an elaborate collaborative fiction that includes speculation about its own reality as part of its entertainment value. The question of who would be doing the disclosing is also significant. SCP entries come from anonymous contributors, people using usernames without verification of identity. If agencies were using SCP for disclosure, they'd need people inside the community contributing entries, and those people would be indistinguishable from any other contributors. The democratic, collaborative nature of SCP means anyone can add content as long as it meets quality standards, which makes it perfect for covert disclosure, but also means that attributing any particular entry to actual classified sources is impossible without information beyond what's publicly available. The legal protection that fiction provides cannot be overstated. Classification laws apply to factual information. If something is presented as fiction, its publication generally doesn't violate classification, even if the fictional description happens to match classified reality. This creates a loophole that could theoretically be exploited for disclosure purposes. Someone with access to classified information about anomalies could write it up as an SCP entry, publish it as fiction, and be legally protected because they're not claiming it's real, not using it to inform policy or decisions, simply contributing to a collaborative creative project that's explicitly fictional. Whether SCP is disclosure or pure fiction might be a question that can never be definitively answered from outside classified channels. If it is disclosure, those with clearance would know but couldn't confirm it publicly without violating the very classifications the disclosure method is designed to work around. If it's pure fiction, there's no authoritative source that can prove a negative, that can confirm absolutely that no entry has ever been based on real classified phenomena. We're left in epistemological uncertainty, able to argue either position but unable to prove either conclusively. What's undeniable is that SCP has created a cultural framework where anomalies are discussed extensively, where people engage with concepts about reality that go far beyond consensus materialism, where the idea that the world contains impossible things monitored by shadow organizations has become familiar and almost comfortable through fictional exposure. Whether this familiarity is purely entertainment, whether it's accidental preparation for eventual official disclosure of anomalous phenomena, or whether it's deliberate desensitization to make actual disclosure less shocking, if it occurs, the effect is the same. Millions of people have engaged deeply with ideas about reality, being far stranger than we're officially told, about organizations existing beyond public oversight that manage threats we don't know exist, about the world containing things that violate physics and consciousness and sanity, all within a framework labeled fiction, but detailed enough to feel potentially real. The SCP Foundation exists as collaborative fiction, as entertainment, as creative world building that has achieved remarkable depth and cultural impact, whether it also exists in reality, whether somewhere beyond public awareness. Actual facilities contain actual anomalies described in documents that look remarkably like SCP entries, with slightly different details, whether the Foundation's motto of secure, contain, protect is being operationalized by people who can never acknowledge what they do or what they found, remains speculation, remains theory, remains one of those questions where the fiction is either just fiction or the most successful cover story ever devised for phenomena that violate consensus reality so thoroughly that they could only be disclosed through mechanisms that maintain plausible deniability, that allow truth to hide in plain sight, labeled as imagination, that let people discuss and think about and prepare for a world far stranger than they officially believe exists, waiting perhaps for the day when the fiction label gets removed, when someone in authority stands up and says that some of these entries weren't creative writing, but were actual documentation. That SCP was never just a game or a story, but was soft disclosure all along, preparing minds and culture for revelations about what really exists in the shadows. What's really being contained in facilities you'll never visit. What's really secured against public knowledge behind classification barriers that entertainment can pierce when direct disclosure cannot. Making SCP either the most elaborate fiction ever crowd created or the most successful truth hiding as fiction operation ever conducted. And we won't know which until someone with access decides to tell us, or until we stumble into an anomaly ourselves and realize too late that the containment procedures we read as fiction were actually instructions we should have taken seriously. That the warnings embedded in entertainment weren't just for the story, but were genuine attempts to prepare us for reality. That the Foundation is real and has been hiding in the open all along, secure behind the shield of being officially fictional, containing anomalies that officially don't exist, protecting a world that officially doesn't need protection from threats that officially aren't possible. All while we read the files and enjoy the horror and never quite believe that any of it could be true, which might be exactly the point, might be exactly how disclosure works when truth is too strange to be believed, too disruptive to be announced, too dangerous to be confirmed, leaving SCP hovering forever in that liminal space between fiction and reality, where the best secrets hide, where disclosure happens in plain sight, labeled as imagination, where we're told everything while being assured it's nothing, where the truth wears fiction as camouflage and waits patiently for the moment when everyone realizes that what they thought was entertainment was actually education, was actually preparation, was actually the foundation itself, showing us exactly what it does and what it protects us from. Confident that the fiction label would prevent anyone from believing until belief became unavoidable, until the anomalies could no longer be contained, until reality itself broke down enough that official acknowledgement became necessary, and people raised on SCP would be less shocked than those who never engaged with the fiction that might, terrifyingly, have been fact all along. The Alaska Triangle. More disappearances than the Bermuda Triangle. There's a region in Alaska, roughly bounded by Juneau in the southeast, Anchorage to the south central, and Barrow up on the northern coast, that has swallowed more people than the Bermuda Triangle ever claimed, though it receives a fraction of the attention. Since 1988 alone, over 16,000 people have vanished in this triangular expanse of wilderness, mountains, and ice. People who walked into the forest and never returned, who flew into valleys and were never seen again, who disappeared from populated areas in broad daylight, leaving no evidence of where they went or what happened to them. The sheer scale of disappearances is staggering, averaging roughly 4 missing persons for every 1,000 residents, a rate double what occurs anywhere else in the United States. Some of these disappearances have conventional explanations. Alaska is vast, unforgiving terrain where getting lost can mean death within hours, where nature kills efficiently through cold, predation, or accident. But thousands of cases don't fit those patterns, involve circumstances that suggest something beyond environmental hazards is operating in that region, something that takes people in ways that leave investigators baffled and families without answers, without bodies, without closure, without any indication of what fate befell those who entered the Alaska Triangle and joined the thousands who vanished there before them into mystery that deepens with every new disappearance that adds to the count. The term Alaska Triangle is relatively recent, but the phenomenon it describes is ancient. Indigenous peoples of Alaska have legends stretching back centuries about areas that are hungry, that take people, where spirits or entities dwell that should be avoided or approached only with proper rituals and respect. The Tlingits speak of Kushtaka, shape-shifting creatures that lure people into wilderness, particularly near water, using cries that sound like babies or loved ones in distress. Once you follow those sounds, you're never seen again. Other tribes describe regions where reality works differently, where time and space don't function normally, where the boundary between the physical world and spirit world is thin enough that people can slip through and become trapped in dimensions they can't escape from. The modern disappearances began being documented systematically only in the late 20th century, but historical accounts suggest the Triangle has been claiming people since Europeans first arrived. Russian fur traders in the 18th and 19th centuries wrote about expeditions that vanished completely, ships that sailed into Alaskan waters and were never heard from again despite calm weather and experienced crews. During the gold rush, entire prospecting parties disappeared in the interior, sometimes with no bodies ever recovered despite extensive searches by those hoping to claim their discoveries. The pattern has remained consistent across centuries. People go into the Alaska Triangle, and some percentage of them simply cease to exist in any traceable way. The most famous disappearance within the triangle is probably that of Congressman Hale Boggs and pilot Don Johns in 1972. Boggs was House Majority Leader, one of the most powerful politicians in America, flying from Anchorage to Juneau for a campaign event. The weather was poor, but not catastrophic. The pilot was experienced. The plane simply vanished. Despite one of the largest searches in U.S. history, over 3,000 hours of flying time looking for wreckage, no trace was ever found. Not a piece of debris, not an oil slick, not a signal from the emergency locator. A plane carrying a major political figure simply disappeared over Alaska and was never seen again. The search involved the military, the Coast Guard, and civilian volunteers, covering tens of thousands of square miles. They found nothing. It's as if the plane entered the triangle and transitioned to a state where it was no longer detectable by any means at our disposal. The same year, a military transport plane disappeared in the same region under similar circumstances. Experienced crew, routine flight, suddenly gone without distress signal or wreckage. Both incidents remain unsolved, listed among the thousands of cases where people or vehicles entered the Alaska Triangle and simply stopped existing in any form we can find or measure. The vastness of Alaska is cited as explanation. The terrain is so rugged, so remote, that wreckage could lie undiscovered forever. But this doesn't explain the complete absence of debris fields, the lack of emergency beacon signals that should transmit for days, the failure to find any evidence whatsoever, despite concentrated searches involving sophisticated equipment and massive resource investment. Aircraft disappearances are particularly frequent in the Triangle. Small planes vanish with disturbing regularity. Pilots reporting normal conditions one moment and then going silent. Their planes never arriving at destinations and searches, finding nothing. Alaska has the highest rate of small plane usage in America. It's often the only practical way to reach remote communities, which partially explains the number of incidents. But even accounting for the high volume of flights, the disappearance rate is anomalous. Planes go missing in weather that shouldn't be catastrophic for experienced Alaskan pilots. They vanish in areas that have been searched thoroughly. And in some cases, wreckage is eventually found in locations that make no sense. Dozens of miles from the flight path, in terrain the plane shouldn't have been near, positioned in ways that suggest the plane didn't crash, but was placed. The Kushtaka legends take on disturbing relevance when you examine specific disappearance patterns. People are found, when they're found at all, miles from where they should be, often partially or completely unclothed despite freezing temperatures, sometimes in locations that are physically impossible to reach from their last known position, given the time frame. Bodies are occasionally recovered in states that don't match expected environmental exposure, preserved better than they should be, or decomposed faster, or showing injuries that aren't consistent with falls, animal attacks, or hypothermia. It's as if they experience something that doesn't fit into normal categories of what happens to lost people in wilderness. The Bennington Triangle in Vermont has similar characteristics on a smaller scale, and other locations globally show patterns of unexplained disappearances. But the Alaska Triangle's sheer size and the number of people it's claimed make it unprecedented. The area encompasses approximately 500,000 square miles of mountains, forests, tundra, glaciers, and coastline, terrain that ranges from impenetrable to barely accessible, even with modern equipment. Within this vast region, forces or factors that we don't understand seem to operate with particular intensity, creating conditions where normal rules of survival and discovery don't apply. Where people vanish more completely, than seems possible, even accounting for environmental harshness. Electromagnetic anomalies have been proposed as one factor. Alaska sits near the magnetic North Pole, and the region experiences significant variations in magnetic field strength that can affect compass readings and potentially disrupt aircraft instruments and navigation systems. Some researchers suggest these magnetic anomalies might create conditions where reality itself becomes unstable, where dimensional barriers thin, where people or vehicles can slip between states of existence. The northern lights, which are frequent and intense in Alaska, result from charged particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field. Could this interaction create additional effects we don't understand, opening portals or creating fields that affect consciousness or physical presence? There are also acoustic anomalies reported in the region, sounds that shouldn't carry across the distances they're heard, voices and noises that seem to come from empty wilderness, phenomena that might relate to unusual atmospheric conditions or might represent something else, entities or systems using sound to lure, to communicate, or to manipulate human behavior. The Kushtaka legends specifically mention false voices, cries that lead people away from safety. Modern disappearances include accounts from survivors or from people who encountered the missing shortly before they vanished, describing them as distracted, claiming to hear or see something that wasn't apparent to others, moving towards something they wouldn't or couldn't explain before walking into the wilderness and disappearing. The psychological aspect can't be ignored. The isolation, the vast empty spaces, the knowledge that you're hundreds of miles from help can create mental states where people make irrational decisions or experience phenomena they might not encounter in more populated or familiar environments. But this doesn't explain paired or group disappearances where multiple people vanish simultaneously, or cases where experienced outdoorsmen with survival training and equipment simply cease to exist despite having no reason to leave marked trails or safe areas. Native guides who work in the Triangle often refuse to go into certain areas, places that have bad reputation, not from documented incidents, but from traditional knowledge passed down through generations. They describe spots where people feel watched, where animals don't go, where the quality of light or sound is wrong, where staying too long produces overwhelming compulsion to leave, even if you can't articulate why. These zones of discomfort might correlate with higher disappearance rates, suggesting that indigenous knowledge has identified genuinely dangerous areas through centuries of observation, areas where whatever causes the disappearances is more active or more concentrated. The question of what happens to the bodies in cases where people are known to have died but remains are never found also suggests something unusual. Alaska has predators, bears, wolves, that scavenge and might disperse remains. But complete disappearance of all physical evidence across thousands of cases, including clothing, equipment, and skeletal material that should persist, indicates either remarkably efficient disposal by natural processes or something actively removing or concealing evidence. Some bodies that are eventually found show signs they were moved after death, positioned deliberately rather than coming to rest naturally, which implies either human involvement, which is rarely evident and rarely makes sense given the remoteness, or intervention by something else. Time distortions are reported by some who've had unusual experiences in the Triangle and survived. They describe periods where time seemed to stop or accelerate, where hours passed that felt like minutes, or vice versa, where they lost track of days despite being conscious and mobile. If the region has properties that affect temporal perception or actual time flow, this might explain why people aren't found where searches predict them to be. They've traveled further than time would seem to allow, or they've been missing longer than they experienced, or they've died of exposure in time frames that don't match the actual conditions they endured. The overlap with UFO sighting frequency in Alaska is also notable. The Triangle region has high rates of unexplained aerial phenomena. Lights, craft, objects that don't match known aircraft performing maneuvers that shouldn't be possible. Whether UFOs cause disappearances, whether they're attracted to the same anomalous conditions that cause disappearances, or whether they're completely unrelated phenomena that happen to occur in the same region is unclear. But witnesses have reported seeing lights or craft in proximity to areas where people later went missing. And some of the missing were last seen pointing at or discussing unusual things in the sky before they vanished. The missing persons statistics also reveal demographic patterns. Young men in their 20s and 30s are disproportionately represented, which could simply reflect who's most likely to be engaging in risky outdoor activities. But children disappear at rates that are hard to explain through normal causes. They vanish from populated areas, from locations where they should be easily found, and searches that would typically locate a lost child within hours turn up nothing despite extensive effort. The cases often involve the child allegedly wandering off, but the distances traveled before disappearance would be implausible for their age. Or they're found eventually in locations that don't make sense given their starting point and mobility. Military involvement in searches sometimes produces strange elements. Searchers are occasionally redirected away from certain areas without clear explanation. Or searches are called off prematurely despite families insisting more could be done. Rumors persist about classified incidents, military personnel who've gone missing during operations in the Triangle, and whose cases are handled differently than civilian disappearances. If military installations or activities in the region have experienced losses they can't explain, official policy would be to contain that information while attempting to understand or prevent future incidents without alarming the public. The totality of disappearances, over 16,000 since 1988 alone, represents an astonishing number of people who've entered the Alaska Triangle and not come back. Even if 95% have conventional explanations, accidents, voluntary disappearances, deaths from environmental exposure where bodies weren't recovered, that still leaves hundreds of cases that don't fit normal patterns, that suggest something genuinely anomalous is occurring in that region with frequency that should command significant scientific investigation, but that instead gets absorbed into statistics and attributed to Alaska's harsh environment without deeper analysis. For families of the missing, the Alaska Triangle is a void that took their loved ones and provided nothing back. No bodies, no answers, no closure. They live with permanent uncertainty, knowing that someone went into that region and didn't return, that searches found nothing, that the case eventually went cold because there was nowhere else to look and nothing else to investigate. The Triangle keeps its secrets, whatever they are, whether they're natural phenomena we don't yet understand, whether they're predators or entities that hunt in ways we can't track, whether they're dimensional anomalies that trap people in realities they can't escape from, or whether they're simply the accumulated result of thousands of individual tragedies in unforgiving terrain that happens to be bounded by 3 points that create a convenient frame for pattern-seeking humans to project meaning onto. But the sheer scale suggests something more than random tragedy. 16,000 people is a small city. That many people disappearing from any other bounded region would trigger massive investigations, would demand explanations, would be treated as a crisis requiring solutions. In the Alaska Triangle, it's almost normalized, accepted as the price of living in or traveling through one of the last truly wild places on Earth. And perhaps that normalization is what allows whatever actually causes the anomalous disappearances to continue operating. We've attributed so many cases to environmental factors that we've stopped seriously investigating whether all of them actually have environmental causes. whether some percentage represents something else, something that takes people for reasons we don't understand using methods we can't detect. Something that has claimed 16,000 lives in less than 40 years and shows no sign of slowing. That continues to operate in the vast wilderness between Juneau and Anchorage and Barrow, in mountains and forests and tundra where reality might work differently than it does elsewhere, where the boundaries between known and unknown are thinner, where people who enter might not simply get lost or die of exposure, but might transition into states or places that searches can never reach because they exist outside the physical geography we're searching, trapped or taken or transformed by whatever makes the Alaska Triangle more than just harsh environment, makes it a genuine mystery that has swallowed more people than any other location on Earth and left behind only absence, only the haunting uncertainty that comes from knowing thousands entered and thousands never returned. And whatever took them isn't done, is still there, waiting for the next person to fly over the wrong valley, or hike into the wrong forest, or follow the wrong sound into wilderness that has proven over 16,000 times that it can make people disappear more completely than should be possible, leaving the Alaska Triangle standing as the most deadly and mysterious region in North America, claiming victims at a rate that dwarfs the famous Bermuda Triangle, while receiving a fraction of the attention, operating in relative obscurity in one of the last wild frontiers, taking people into darkness that never gives them back. The backrooms, infinite liminal spaces beyond reality. There's a place you can end up if you're unlucky enough to clip through reality at the wrong moment. If the membrane separating normal space from what lies beneath it suddenly fails. If you take a step and somehow miss the floor and fall not down but sideways, out of the world entirely. It's not another planet or dimension in the science fiction sense. It's more like you've fallen behind the scenery of reality itself, into the infrastructure that holds everything else up, the space between spaces where physics works differently and geometry refuses to make sense. People call it the backrooms because that's exactly what it feels like. You've wandered into the back areas of existence, the maintenance corridors and storage spaces that were never meant to be inhabited, that exist only to support what's in front. And now you're trapped in approximately 600 million square miles of empty rooms that go on forever, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, carpeted in damp industrial carpet that squelches under your feet, stretching in every direction with no exit, no windows, no way back to the reality you fell out of. The most common description of level 0, the first layer most people encounter, is disturbingly consistent. You find yourself in what looks like an abandoned office building, but the space extends impossibly far. Walls painted in yellowing wallpaper or beige paint. Drop ceiling tiles overhead with fluorescent panels that flicker occasionally, some of them dead, casting sections in shadow. The carpet is moist, always moist, though you never see water and can't identify why the dampness persists. The air smells like old paper and mildew, and something else you can't quite name, something chemical and wrong. And most disturbing of all, the space is maze-like, but seems to have no purpose. Rooms connect to hallways that lead to more rooms. Doors open onto identical spaces. You can walk for hours without seeing anything different, without finding any indication that this place was built for any function beyond existing as empty, purposeless architecture that goes on forever. What makes the backrooms particularly terrifying is the absolute certainty that you're somewhere you shouldn't be, that this place wasn't designed for human habitation or occupation. Everything about it feels wrong. The proportions of the rooms are slightly off, ceilings too low or too high, doorways that force you to duck or that tower over you unnecessarily. The lighting creates shadows that don't match the position of the fixtures. Sound behaves strangely, some noises carrying for impossible distances, while others get swallowed completely. Your footsteps on the damp carpet make sounds that echo wrong. as if the space around you is both smaller and vastly larger than it appears. And there's the constant hum, that electrical drone of the fluorescent lights mixed with something deeper, a vibration you feel in your chest more than hear, suggesting machinery or systems operating somewhere beyond the walls, maintaining this place for reasons you'll never understand. Time doesn't work correctly in the backrooms. People report losing track of how long they've been wandering, unable to distinguish between hours and days. There's no natural light, no windows, no way to mark the passage of time except by exhaustion and the demands of your body for sleep and food. But even these become unreliable. You might feel like you've been walking for days, but your watch, if it still works, shows only hours have passed. Or you might walk for what feels like an hour, only to find that according to any measure you can access, far more time has elapsed. The space seems to absorb duration, to stretch or compress it according to rules that have nothing to do with physics as we understand it. The method of entry is where things get particularly strange and unsettling. People don't choose to enter the backrooms. They no-clip, to use the terminology that's emerged from video game culture. They somehow pass through solid reality into the space behind it. This can happen anywhere, anytime, with no warning and no clear trigger. You might be walking down a hallway and take a step that somehow doesn't land on the floor, but passes through it. You might lean against a wall that suddenly offers no resistance, and you fall sideways into yellow corridors that smell of mildew. You might be alone in a building and turn a corner only to find yourself somewhere that's definitely not part of the structure you entered, somewhere that couldn't physically fit inside it. And when you try to backtrack, the corner you just turned no longer leads back to where you came from. The phenomenon seems to occur more frequently in liminal spaces, areas that exist in transition, that are designed for passage rather than occupation. Stairwells, long hallways, empty parking garages, loading docks, the back rooms of retail stores that customers never see. These spaces, which already feel slightly unreal and unsettling even in normal reality, seem to have thinner barriers, places where it's easier to accidentally slip through into what lies beneath. The liminal quality itself might be the vulnerability, as if spaces that exist only to connect other spaces don't have the same reality density, the same solid presence, as rooms and areas where people actually live and work and exist with intention. Once inside, navigation becomes a nightmare. The layout shifts or doesn't follow logical patterns. You can mark your path, leaving indicators to track where you've been, only to find yourself back in the same room, even though you swear you turned different directions. Some explorers report that the backrooms actively reconfigure, that walls and doorways move when you're not looking, that the maze changes its shape to keep you disoriented and lost. Others believe the space is simply so vast and repetitive that you can't effectively navigate it, that you're walking in circles without realizing because every room looks identical and your sense of direction degrades in the absence of landmarks or variation. But level 0 is just the beginning. Those who survive long enough, who manage to avoid going insane from the isolation and repetition, report finding ways to descend or ascend to other levels, each with their own characteristics and dangers. Level 1 is described as darker, the lights functioning less reliably, areas plunged into shadow where you need alternative illumination. Level 2 becomes industrial, concrete tunnels, and metal pipes, the sound of water dripping or rushing behind walls. Level 3 is an electrical station, arrays of machinery humming with dangerous voltage, metal grating underfoot, and the ever-present risk of electrocution. Each level gets stranger, more hostile, less resembling anything that could plausibly exist in normal reality. And you're not alone in the backrooms. This is perhaps the worst realization, the moment when you understand that the emptiness isn't total, that something else inhabits these spaces. Entities, most survivors call them, though the word covers a range of phenomena, from the merely strange to the actively predatory. Some entities seem to be former humans who've been there so long they've changed, degraded into things that still vaguely resemble people, but have lost critical elements of humanity. Others appear to have never been human at all, creatures that exist in the spaces between reality, that patrol the fluorescent hallways on business you can't understand, that will hunt you if they detect your presence. The Smilers are mentioned frequently in accounts, entities that exist primarily in darkness, visible only as the whites of their eyes and their teeth, grinning from shadows before rushing forward at speeds that shouldn't be possible. The Skin Stealers, which are exactly what their name suggests, creatures that wear human skin like clothing, hunting other humans to acquire new skins when their current coverings degrade. The Hounds, which look almost like dogs but wrong, too many joints or wrong proportions, moving in packs through the corridors, attracted to noise and movement. And Stranger Things, entities that don't have names because survivors didn't live long enough to document them properly. Things glimpsed in peripheral vision or heard moving in adjacent rooms. Threats that never fully manifest, but whose presence is undeniable. The psychological toll of the backrooms might be worse than the physical danger. Absolute isolation in an environment that makes no sense, where you can't orient yourself, where every corridor looks identical and leads nowhere meaningful. The human mind requires stimulation, variation, social contact, purpose. The backrooms provide none of these. You wander endlessly through repetitive architecture under harsh fluorescent lighting. The hum of electricity and the squelch of damp carpet your only stimuli. Knowing that you're trapped in a space that extends far beyond what you could walk in a lifetime. With no map, no exit, no hope of rescue, because no one even knows where you are. People break. They curl up in corners and stop moving. They start talking to themselves or to entities that aren't there. They make elaborate rituals or rules that give them purpose even though the rules are meaningless. Anything to impose order on chaos, meaning on emptiness, structure on an environment that refuses to provide any. Some accounts describe finding other people in the backrooms, survivors who've been there for indeterminate periods, who've maybe learned how to find safer areas or resources that make survival possible. These encounters are desperate and often dangerous. Some survivors have maintained enough humanity to cooperate, to share information about navigating the levels or avoiding entities. Others have degraded into paranoia and violence, attacking anyone they encounter out of fear or for resources. And some might not be survivors at all, but mimics, entities that appear human until you're close enough that it's too late to escape, that use the desperate human need for social contact as a lure. There are theories about what the backrooms actually are. Some propose it's a pocket dimension, a separate reality that exists parallel to ours, accessible through flaws or weak points in the barrier between worlds. Others suggest it's a construct, something built by intelligence we can't comprehend for purposes we'll never understand. Maybe a testing ground, or storage facility, or prison for beings that perceive reality differently than humans do. Some believe it's a manifestation of collective unconscious, the accumulated psychic weight of all the liminal spaces humans have created, office buildings and storage facilities, and empty corridors, somehow coalescing into an actual space that exists outside normal geography. The most disturbing theory is that the backrooms are infrastructure, the literal backrooms of reality, the space where the architecture supporting our universe is located. What we experience as normal reality is the facade, the finished surface, but underneath and behind it is this vast network of maintenance corridors and empty rooms where the actual machinery of existence operates. When you no-clip, you're not traveling to another dimension. You're simply falling behind the scenery, ending up in areas that were never meant to be accessed by conscious beings, but that must exist for the conscious accessible areas to function. And if this is true, if the backrooms are fundamental infrastructure, then the entities inhabiting them might be maintenance workers or security systems, things that exist to keep the machinery running, that regard human intruders the way we'd regard a bug that somehow got inside a computer case, unwelcome, potentially damaging, to be removed or eliminated. The mythology of the backrooms has grown extensively online, with collaborative world-building creating increasingly elaborate lore about different levels, entities, survival strategies, and groups of survivors who've established territories or safe zones within the hostile environment. Skeptics correctly note that this is creepypasta, internet horror fiction, a collaborative creative project rather than documentation of a real place. The backrooms originated as a single image posted to a forum, a photograph of an empty room with yellow walls and fluorescent lighting that captured something unsettling about liminal architecture. And the mythology built from there, users contributing their own experiences and ideas until it became a vast shared universe of horror. But the reason the backrooms resonate so powerfully, the reason the concept spread so rapidly and inspired such extensive elaboration, is that it taps into something we all recognize. The feeling of being in a liminal space that exists only as transition between destinations. The uncanny unease of empty architecture that seems to serve no purpose. The nightmare logic of being trapped in a maze that won't let you leave, that reconfigures to keep you lost, where exhaustion and terror gradually erode your sanity. These are anxieties embedded deep in human consciousness, and the backrooms give them specific form and geography. There's also something about modern existence that the backrooms capture perfectly. We spend our lives in artificial environments, climate-controlled boxes lit by fluorescent tubes or LED panels, breathing recirculated air, walking on industrial carpet, surrounded by beige walls and drop ceilings. Office buildings, shopping malls, apartment complexes, airports, all designed with similar aesthetics, similar materials, similar proportions. The spaces blur together. You could be in Denver or Dallas or Detroit, and the interior spaces look identical. We've created liminal architecture as the dominant environment of modern life, places that exist purely functionally with no character, no identity, no evidence of human occupation beyond their shape. The backrooms are just the logical extension, the pure distillation of this aesthetic, stripped of even the minimal purpose that normal buildings serve. Whether the backrooms exist as actual place you could physically enter, as psychological space that people experience during mental breaks or sleep paralysis, or purely as collective fiction that resonates because it articulates modern anxieties, doesn't change the fact that the concept has power. It speaks to the fear of being lost, of being alone, of being trapped in an environment that makes no sense and offers no comfort. It captures the horror of endless empty rooms that go nowhere, of fluorescent lights that never turn off, of damp carpet and yellowed wallpaper, and the constant electrical hum of a place that exists purely to exist, without purpose or meaning or end. And late at night, when you're alone in a building, when you walk down a long hallway that seems slightly too empty, slightly too quiet, when you turn a corner, and for just a moment, you're not quite sure where you are, or whether the space you're in connects back to where you started, there's a small voice that whispers, maybe it's possible. Maybe reality has weak spots. Maybe you could take one wrong step and fall through into endless yellow corridors that smell like mildew and desperation, into the buzzing fluorescent forever of the backrooms, where you'd wander until you died or changed into something that belongs there. Another entity haunting the liminal spaces between real places, waiting in the empty rooms behind reality for the next person to clip through and join you in the endless maze that has no exit, no purpose, no meaning except to exist as the infrastructure supporting everything else. The spaces between spaces, the rooms behind the world. The Anjikuni Lake disappearance. An entire village vanished. In November 1930, according to accounts that emerged decades later, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle arrived at a small Inuit village near Anjikuni Lake in the Kavalik region of Nunavut, Canada. A settlement he had visited many times before, where he expected to find the usual welcome of a functioning community, going about their daily survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Instead, he found emptiness that defied explanation. The village was completely abandoned, not in the gradual way communities sometimes decline and disperse, but suddenly and recently, as if every resident had simultaneously stopped whatever they were doing and vanished. Fires had burned down to embers in the homes, suggesting recent occupation. Food was still cooking or prepared for meals, indicating people had been interrupted mid-activity. Rifles, which in that environment were essential survival tools that no one would willingly abandon, remained in the dwellings. Kayaks, necessary for transportation and fishing, were still tied at the shore. Sled dogs, crucial for winter survival, were found dead, not from violence, but from starvation, tied to their posts and left to die as if their owners had disappeared without warning or concern. For the animals that depended on them for life, as much as the owners depended on the dogs. Between 30 and 2,000 people, depending on which version of the story you encounter, had simply ceased to exist in this location, leaving behind all their possessions and provisions, leaving behind a functioning village that had become a ghost town. Overnight, for reasons that were never explained, never investigated thoroughly enough to produce official conclusions, and that remain one of the most disturbing mass disappearance cases in North American history, if it actually happened, because the evidence for the Anjikuni Lake disappearance is frustratingly ambiguous. Mixing documented facts with folklore embellishment, combining indigenous oral traditions with journalist exaggeration, creating a story that might be entirely true or partially fabricated or completely fictional, leaving us unable to determine whether an entire village actually vanished in circumstances that suggest abduction, disaster, or something beyond conventional explanation, or whether the story itself is the phenomenon. A narrative that emerged from the northern wilderness and achieved legendary status despite questionable historical foundation. The primary account comes from Joe LaBelle, the fur trapper, who allegedly reported the disappearance to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, triggering an investigation that supposedly found the village exactly as he described, abandoned, with possessions intact, with no signs of struggle or violence, with no indication of where the inhabitants had gone or why they would leave their essential survival equipment behind. But the historical records of this RCMP investigation are elusive at best, possibly lost or destroyed, possibly never thoroughly documented, or possibly non-existent because the investigation never happened in the form the legends describe. The first detailed published account appeared years after the alleged event, in articles by writer Frank Edwards, who specialized in paranormal and unexplained phenomena, who presented the Anjikuni case as documented fact, but whose sources and verification methods weren't rigorous by journalistic or historical standards, who may have been reporting an actual event, or may have been embellishing or fabricating, based on fragmentary rumors and indigenous legends about disappearances in the Northern Territories. The geographical challenges complicate investigation. The Kavalik region is vast, remote, sparsely populated even now, and was far more inaccessible in 1930. Anjikuni Lake exists. It's a real location in Nunavut. But identifying which specific settlement allegedly disappeared is problematic because Inuit communities in that era were often seasonal or semi-nomadic, moving with hunting and fishing opportunities, not always maintaining permanent year-round villages in fixed locations. A community might abandon a settlement for entirely normal reasons, following caribou migrations, relocating to better fishing, consolidating with other groups for winter survival. And to an outsider unfamiliar with these patterns, the abandoned site might appear mysterious when it was actually routine adaptation to environment and circumstance. The population numbers vary wildly across different tellings, from 30 to several hundred, to the implausible 2,000 that some accounts claim. Variations that suggest either confusion about which community or event is being described, or progressive exaggeration as the story was retold across decades. 2,000 people vanishing would be a catastrophic event that absolutely would have generated extensive investigation and documentation, regardless of the location's remoteness. 30 people from a small seasonal camp relocating would be entirely unremarkable and might not generate any official notice at all, particularly in that era when Indigenous communities in remote Canada weren't always closely monitored or recorded by colonial authorities. The dead sled dogs are among the most disturbing elements, if accurate. Inuit relationships with sled dogs were intimate and essential. These animals were survival tools, companions, transportation, and hunting aids that were treated with the care that critical equipment receives. Leaving them tied and unfed until they starved violates not just practical survival logic, but cultural values about animal treatment and responsibility. If the dogs were found dead as described, it suggests either sudden catastrophic event that prevented anyone from returning to care for them, or it suggests fabrication because the detail is so implausible from cultural and practical perspectives that its inclusion might indicate someone unfamiliar with actual Inuit practices inventing dramatic details. The theories about what happened, if anything happened, range across familiar territory. Abduction by unknown parties, though the logistics of abducting an entire community in remote Arctic environment without evidence and without any survivors or witnesses seem implausible. Mass death from disease or contamination, though this should have left bodies and should have been investigated given the public health implications. Voluntary relocation that appeared sudden to the outsider observer, but was actually planned by the community for reasons they had no obligation to communicate to visiting trappers. Natural disaster like sudden flooding, ice breakage, or other environmental event that killed or dispersed the population, though the intact possessions and structures argue against violent environmental catastrophe. Massacre or violence from hostile groups, though again the absence of bodies and destruction argues against this. Supernatural or paranormal explanations involving portals, alien abduction, dimensional shifts, or other exotic possibilities that can't be disproven, but that require extraordinary evidence that isn't available. The cultural dimension is significant. Indigenous communities across the Arctic and subarctic have oral traditions about disappearances, about people who went into the wilderness and never returned, about spirits or entities that take people, about places where reality behaves strangely. These traditions likely reflect real incidents, individuals getting lost and dying of exposure, small groups disappearing due to accidents or violence or starvation, that were interpreted through cultural frameworks that included supernatural explanations. The Anjikuni disappearance might be a specific historical event that was absorbed into this tradition, might be multiple separate incidents collapsed into a single narrative, or might be entirely folkloric, a story that expresses cultural anxieties about disappearance and the dangers of the northern environment through a fictional or heavily fictionalized event. The timing in 1930 places the alleged disappearance in a period of significant cultural disruption for Arctic indigenous peoples. Colonial authorities were increasingly asserting control. Traditional ways of life were being pressured by external forces. Disease and economic changes were affecting communities. In this context, communities might relocate suddenly to avoid census taking, to escape restrictions, to maintain autonomy from authorities they didn't trust. What appeared to a trapper as mysterious abandonment might have been deliberate evasion of colonial oversight, the community moving to a new location and intentionally leaving their old site in ways that would confuse outsiders. The lack of RCMP documentation is the most significant evidentiary problem. If an entire village disappeared under mysterious circumstances and a trapper reported it to police, there should be reports, investigation notes, outcome documentation, something in the historical record beyond the secondary and tertiary accounts that appeared in books and articles years after the alleged event. The absence of this documentation suggests either it was never properly investigated, which would indicate authorities didn't consider it mysterious because they had mundane explanation for the empty settlement, or the investigation records were lost or destroyed, or the investigation never happened because the report was never made, because Joe LaBelle himself might be a fictional or composite character, because the entire event might be fabrication or heavy embellishment of something far more mundane. But the story persists and continues to be retold precisely because it captures primal fears about disappearance, about communities ceasing to exist suddenly and inexplicably, about the wilderness swallowing people without trace or explanation. Whether it's historically accurate or not, it functions as modern mythology, as a narrative that expresses anxiety about how fragile human presence is in harsh environments, how quickly a functioning community can become ruins, how little trace we leave when we're removed from the landscape, how easily we can vanish if circumstances align against us. The comparison to other mass disappearance cases is inevitable. The Roanoke colony, where English settlers vanished, leaving only the cryptic carving Croatoan, is probably the most famous historical case of community disappearance. And while evidence suggests the colonists dispersed to live with indigenous populations, the mystery endures in popular consciousness as unexplained vanishing. The Mary Celeste, the ship found abandoned with no crew, despite being seaworthy and well supplied, represents maritime equivalent. These cases share characteristics with Anjikuni, people apparently abandoning possessions and safety without obvious reason, leaving environments that should contain them mysteriously empty. The difference is that Roanoke and Mary Celeste have contemporary documentation, have investigations that can be studied and analyzed, have physical evidence that researchers can examine. Anjikuni Lake, if it happened, has become filtered through decades of retelling without apparent access to primary sources, without ability to verify basic facts like population size or even which specific village was involved, making it more legend than history, more story than documented event. This doesn't prove it didn't happen. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly for events in remote locations involving marginalized populations whose experiences weren't always recorded by dominant culture. But it makes the case fundamentally different from disappearances where we have solid historical foundation, even if we don't have complete explanations. The modern investigations and research into Anjikuni have produced ambiguous results. Some researchers claim to have found documentation supporting the basic facts. Others conclude the event was fabricated or grossly exaggerated. Still others argue that something happened, but that details have been so corrupted through retelling that reconstructing the actual event is impossible. The lack of consensus among researchers who've attempted to verify the case reflects the fundamental evidence problem. There isn't enough reliable primary source material to build definitive conclusions, leaving everyone to interpret the available fragmentary information through their own frameworks and biases. For believers in the paranormal or conspiratorial cover-ups, Anjikuni Lake represents evidence of something extraordinary that was suppressed or ignored by authorities, that demonstrates reality contains threats or phenomena that official narratives don't acknowledge. For skeptics, it represents how legends develop, how stories get embellished through retelling, how lack of documentation allows speculation to flourish unchecked by facts. For those interested in Indigenous history and colonial dynamics, it represents how Indigenous experiences were often not recorded properly, how events in Native communities might not receive investigation or documentation that similar events in settler communities would receive, how historical gaps and absences can be as revealing as what's documented. What remains is a story, powerful and disturbing, about an entire village that vanished from the northern wilderness, leaving behind their homes and possessions, and even their crucial survival equipment, disappearing so completely that no trace of them was found, no explanation emerged, no resolution ever came. Whether this story describes actual events in November 1930, or whether it's folklore that has been presented as history, the narrative endures because it touches something deep about human vulnerability, about how quickly we can vanish, about how the wilderness we imagine we control can reclaim us without warning, about how little may remain to mark our presence after we're gone. The empty village, the cold hearths, the starving dogs, the rifles left behind, the kayaks unused. These images carry weight regardless of their historical accuracy, because they represent the fragility of human settlement, the temporary nature of our occupation of hostile environments, the fact that we exist at the sufferance of forces we don't control, and that can remove us with terrifying completeness. Whether anyone actually vanished from Anjikuni Lake, or whether the vanishing is itself a ghost story, a legend that emerged from the northern darkness to haunt those who hear it, the case serves as reminder that the historical record is incomplete, that events in remote places involving marginalized peoples might not be documented in ways that satisfy modern evidentiary standards. That absence of clear evidence for extraordinary claims doesn't always mean the claims are false, but might mean the documentation was never done, or has been lost, or wasn't considered important enough to preserve. And so the village remains, in story, if not in fact, empty and mysterious on the shore of Anjikuni Lake, waiting for explanation that may never come, waiting for the vanished inhabitants to return, or for investigators to finally determine what happened or didn't happen. Frozen in narrative perpetuity as the village that vanished completely, leaving only questions, only speculation, only the unsettling story of Joe LaBelle arriving to find everyone gone and nothing making sense, finding abandonment where community should be, finding silence where voices should carry, finding the terrible emptiness of a place where humans were but aren't anymore, where life was interrupted and never resumed, where 30 or 300 or 2,000 people ceased to exist in that location for reasons that remain, after more than 90 years, completely unexplained or completely fabricated, and we may never know which. Skinwalker Ranch, where reality stops making sense. There's a 512-acre property in Utah's Uintah Basin where the laws of physics appear to be optional, where phenomena from a dozen different paranormal categories occur simultaneously and without apparent pattern, where witnesses have documented cattle mutilations, UFO sightings, poltergeist activity, cryptid encounters, portal manifestations, time distortions, consciousness alterations, and technological anomalies with such frequency that the ranch has become one of the most studied locations in paranormal research, yet it remains completely unexplained. Scientists with credentials from prestigious institutions have investigated it. The military has taken interest. billionaires have purchased it specifically to fund research. And after decades of study involving everything from conventional instruments to exotic sensors, no one can adequately explain what happens there or why this particular piece of land seems to be a nexus point where multiple types of impossible phenomena converge and manifest with disturbing regularity. Whatever is occurring at Skinwalker Ranch defies categorization because it's not one phenomenon, but dozens. Not a single mystery, but a cascade of overlapping anomalies that suggest either the location is unique in ways that science doesn't understand, or that our entire framework for understanding reality is incomplete, that there are layers or systems operating in that space that render our normal rules of cause and effect temporarily suspended, creating an area where literally anything can happen and frequently does, where witnesses experience things that shouldn't be possible and then watch them disappear or transform before evidence can be properly documented, as if something is deliberately demonstrating that our understanding of how reality works is fundamentally flawed, and nowhere makes that clearer than this specific ranch in northeastern Utah, where reality itself seems to have stopped making sense. The modern documented history begins with the Sherman family, not their real name, used in early reports to protect privacy, who purchased the ranch in 1994, planning to run cattle and live quietly in rural Utah. Within days of moving in, they began experiencing phenomena that escalated from strange to terrifying with astonishing speed. They saw enormous wolves that seemed unaffected when shot at close range, animals that would walk up to the family, be hit with bullets that should have been lethal, and simply walk away without apparent injury or concern. Cattle were found mutilated in ways that matched classic cattle mutilation patterns. Organs removed with surgical precision, blood drained, cuts that appeared to be made with advanced technology, no footprints or evidence of human approach. Objects would move on their own, doors would lock and unlock, lights would appear in the sky, performing maneuvers that violated everything the Shermans knew about aircraft capabilities. The Shermans reported seeing what they could only describe as portals, apertures of light that would open in the air from which entities or craft would emerge before the opening closed and disappeared. They saw large craft hovering silently over the property, objects that would descend within feet of witnesses, emit no sound despite their size, and then accelerate away at speeds that should have created sonic booms but produced only silence. They heard voices speaking in the house when no one was there. Equipment would malfunction without explanation. Animals exhibited terror responses to things the humans couldn't perceive. And the overall atmosphere of the property shifted from ordinary ranch land to something that felt hostile and wrong, as if the space itself was aware and watching. The family lasted less than 2 years before the constant phenomena drove them to sell. Their neighbors had known about the ranch's reputation for decades. Navajo legends identified the area as cursed, as a place where skinwalkers, witches who can transform into animals, practiced dark magic, where the boundary between worlds was thin, where humans shouldn't spend extended time because the entities that lived there would notice and take interest. The Ute tribe, whose reservation borders the ranch property, considered it forbidden, a place of bad medicine that was to be avoided. The Shermans learned these warnings too late, after they'd already committed to the property and experienced enough to understand why locals stayed away. In 1996, businessman Robert Bigelow purchased the ranch through his National Institute for Discovery Science, an organization he'd created specifically to study anomalous phenomena. Bigelow brought in scientists, installed surveillance equipment, stationed observers continuously on the property, and began what would become years of documented investigation, attempting to understand what was happening there and why. The NIDS team collected enormous amounts of data, witnessed phenomena that multiple credible observers documented, experienced equipment failures, and technological interference that suggested active opposition to their investigation and came away with conclusions that remain largely classified or unpublished. But that convinced Bigelow the ranch represented something genuinely extraordinary, something that exceeded his ability or resources to fully investigate or understand. The NIDS team reported similar phenomena to what the Shermans experienced, but with additional categories that emerged with systematic observation. They documented radiation spikes without identifiable sources, magnetic field anomalies that would appear and vanish without pattern, biological effects on observers that included missing time, sudden illness, psychological disturbances that would begin during ranch visits, and sometimes persist after leaving the property. Equipment would fail in ways that couldn't be explained mechanically. Cameras would malfunction when phenomena appeared. Recording devices would show battery drain that exceeded any normal rate, and in some cases the equipment would be found damaged in ways that suggested intentional interference rather than random failure. The phenomena seemed intelligent and responsive. When investigators set up to observe one area, activity would shift to different locations. When they deployed certain types of sensors, the phenomena would avoid those areas or would interact with the sensors in ways that produced data that was either useless or actively misleading. There was a sense of being toyed with, of something that was aware of the investigation and was either evading systematic study or was performing for the investigators, showing them things that would be disturbing or confusing, but never quite providing the clear evidence that would allow definitive conclusions. Witnesses described feeling watched constantly, having the impression that something was studying them as much as they were trying to study it. The cattle mutilations at Skinwalker Ranch share characteristics with the broader cattle mutilation phenomenon documented across the American West, but they occur with higher frequency and sometimes with additional anomalies. Animals have been found mutilated in locations they couldn't have reached on their own, positioned in ways that suggest they were moved after death, but with no tracks or evidence of how they were transported. The precision of the cuts, the apparent use of heat or tools that cauterize as they incise, the selective removal of specific organs while leaving others untouched, and the absence of blood despite living animals containing gallons, all suggest technology or techniques that aren't readily available and that serve purposes we can only speculate about. The cryptozoological elements include sightings of creatures that don't match known animals. The giant wolves that terrorized the Sherman family, creatures described as 7 or 8 feet tall when standing on hind legs, with massive heads and predatory intelligence that seemed to understand they were being threatened with weapons, but showed no fear or normal animal response patterns. Witnesses have reported humanoid figures, beings that appear human from a distance, but wrong upon closer observation. Entities that vanish when approached, or that seem to phase in and out of visibility. There are accounts of creatures that combine animal and human features, classic cryptid descriptions that match historical reports of skinwalkers and shapeshifters from indigenous traditions. The interdimensional hypothesis is frequently proposed because the range of phenomena suggests not a single source, but multiple types of manifestation, all occurring in the same location. If Skinwalker Ranch sits at a point where dimensional barriers are thin or compromised, where our reality overlaps with others more frequently or completely than elsewhere, then you'd expect exactly what's observed: phenomena from multiple categories, entities and objects that phase in and out, physical laws that appear to suspend temporarily, consciousness effects that suggest our mental reality and external reality are interacting in unusual ways. The portals or apertures that witnesses describe would be literal openings between dimensions, allowing things from elsewhere to briefly enter our space before the opening closes. The government and military interest in Skinwalker Ranch is documented but largely classified. Bigelow had contracts with defense and intelligence agencies, and some of his ranch research was reportedly shared with these groups. After Bigelow sold the property in 2016 to an anonymous buyer, later revealed to be Brandon Fugel, a commercial real estate magnate, the new ownership continued systematic study with enhanced resources and brought in aerospace and defense industry expertise to analyze the phenomena. The current research involves sophisticated sensor arrays, multiple simultaneous observation methods, and teams attempting to actively provoke phenomena to occur on demand rather than waiting for random manifestations. The television series The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch documents some of the ongoing investigation, though skeptics note that reality TV formats incentivize drama and ambiguity over rigorous science. The show has documented unusual readings, unexplained occurrences, and events that seem to support the ranch's anomalous reputation. But the evidence presented is filtered through entertainment requirements and doesn't undergo the peer review or replication that scientific conclusions require. Still, the series has brought mainstream attention to the location and has added to the documented record of strange occurrences, even if the format makes it difficult to separate genuine anomaly from production manipulation or misinterpretation. The mesa that overlooks the ranch property is considered particularly active, with accounts of craft emerging from or disappearing into the mesa itself, as if it contains internal spaces or serves as a portal or base for whatever is generating the phenomena. Teams have attempted to access the interior of the mesa through ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing, finding anomalies in the readings that suggest cavities or structures that aren't accessible through normal means, or that perhaps exist in dimensional states that sensors can partially detect, but that can't be physically reached. Consciousness effects are among the most disturbing elements reported by investigators and visitors. People describe altered states while on the property, time distortions where minutes feel like hours, or vice versa, memories becoming confused or missing entirely for periods spent at the ranch. Some report lasting psychological effects, changes in perception or cognition that persist after leaving, as if exposure to whatever operates there created permanent alterations in how their consciousness functions. Whether these effects result from exotic energy fields, from direct mental manipulation by whatever intelligence operates the phenomena, or from trauma responses to experiencing things that violate their understanding of reality, remains unclear. The proximity to the Uinta Basin's unusual geology and the Ute Reservation has led to speculation about whether the location's properties are natural. Something about the geology or magnetic characteristics of the area creates conditions where anomalous phenomena occur more readily. The basin has high rates of UFO reports generally, making the ranch part of a broader regional pattern, rather than an isolated location. Whether the ranch is uniquely active within an already active region, or whether the concentrated observation and documentation there simply captures phenomena that occur throughout the basin but go unrecorded elsewhere, is difficult to determine. The lack of consistent patterns is itself a pattern. Phenomena don't repeat predictably, don't respond to experimental protocols in ways that allow systematic study, don't manifest on demand, even when researchers attempt to create conditions that previously correlated with activity. This suggests either the phenomena are random, which seems unlikely given the intelligence and responsiveness observers report, or they're controlled by something that deliberately avoids allowing systematic documentation. If the goal is to demonstrate that anomalies occur without allowing humans to understand or predict them, the ranch phenomena accomplish that perfectly. Skeptical explanations propose the ranch's reputation creates expectation effects, where observers interpret normal occurrences as paranormal, where ambiguous data gets coded as anomalous, because that's what people are primed to see. The cattle mutilations might be predation or natural decomposition misinterpreted through sensationalist lens. The lights in the sky might be aircraft, drones, satellites, or atmospheric phenomena misidentified by witnesses primed to see UFOs. The equipment failures might be normal malfunction rates that seem significant because they're being interpreted as evidence of something anomalous. The missing time and altered states might be psychological responses to suggestion and the eerie atmosphere of a location that's been labeled as haunted or cursed. But this skeptical framework struggles with the multiplicity and consistency of witness reports, the caliber of some observers who've investigated the ranch, and the fact that phenomena occur even to skeptical investigators who arrive without belief in the paranormal. The NIDS team included PhD scientists who maintained skepticism throughout their investigation, yet documented occurrences they couldn't explain conventionally. Military and aerospace professionals who visited the ranch experienced things that challenged their frameworks despite their training and bias toward rational explanation. If the phenomena were purely psychological or misinterpretation, you'd expect that trained observers specifically looking for normal explanations would find them. Instead, they often become convinced that something genuinely anomalous is occurring. The question of whether Skinwalker Ranch is unique or simply well documented is significant. Other locations globally have similar reputations. Areas where multiple types of paranormal phenomena occur, where reality seems fluid, where witnesses experience things that defy conventional explanation. Skinwalker Ranch might represent an extreme example of something that occurs in degrees at multiple locations, places where for unknown reasons the normal rules loosen, and phenomena from various categories manifest more readily. If we could identify what makes these locations different, whether it's geology, electromagnetic characteristics, historical factors, or something else, we might understand not just Skinwalker Ranch, but the broader phenomenon of places where reality becomes permeable. The ranch continues to be studied, continues to produce reports of phenomena, continues to resist providing definitive answers, even as evidence accumulates. What happens there remains unexplained despite decades of investigation, despite sophisticated equipment, despite serious scientific effort applied by credible researchers. Either the phenomena are real and represent something about reality that science doesn't yet understand, or the entire thing is elaborate misinterpretation and expectation, creating a feedback loop that perpetuates itself through observer bias and media attention. But for those who've spent time there, who've witnessed the phenomena directly, who've experienced things that violated their understanding of what's possible, skepticism becomes harder to maintain. When you see objects that shouldn't be able to fly, when you experience time distortions and missing memory, when equipment fails in your hands, and creatures that shouldn't exist walk through your field of vision, dismissing it as misinterpretation requires ignoring your direct experience in favor of maintaining a worldview where such things can't happen. Skinwalker Ranch stands as a challenge to consensus reality, a specific location where the extraordinary occurs with enough frequency that it can't be dismissed as isolated incidents or individual delusion, where multiple witness categories have documented multiple phenomena types, where investigation continues because the questions remain unanswered and the activity continues. Whether it's a window into dimensions we don't normally access, whether it's a base or observation point for non-human intelligence, whether it's a natural anomaly where physics works differently because of unique local conditions, or whether it's simply a place that's become a focal point for human projection and expectation. Creating the appearance of phenomena through psychological and sociological processes. Rather than objective anomaly, Skinwalker Ranch endures as one of the most documented and least understood locations in paranormal research. Reality stops making sense there, or perhaps more accurately, Reality reveals that it never made as much sense as we thought it did, that the rules we assume are constant and universal might actually be local and conditional, that there are places where different rules apply, or where multiple realities overlap, and that Skinwalker Ranch happens to be one of those places, 512 acres in Utah, where anything can happen and frequently does, where the impossible occurs so regularly that it becomes almost expected, where witnesses arrive skeptical and leave uncertain, where investigation produces data but not understanding, where the mysteries multiply faster than explanations can contain them, where reality itself seems to be performing, demonstrating, showing us that the world is far stranger than our frameworks allow, that consciousness and matter and time and space interact in ways we don't comprehend, and that sometimes, in certain places, under certain conditions, the veil gets thin enough that we can see through to the other side, can glimpse what's always there but usually hidden, can experience reality without the filters and limitations that normally keep us safely confined to the narrow band of perception that makes the universe seem comprehensible and predictable, leaving Skinwalker Ranch as a permanent question mark on the landscape, a challenge to every certainty, a place where reality stops pretending to make sense and reveals itself as something far more complex, far more fluid, far more utterly strange than anything our science or philosophy has properly accounted for, waiting there in northeastern Utah for the next investigator who thinks they'll be the one to finally explain it, to finally solve the mystery, to finally make sense of the place where sense doesn't apply, where reality plays by different rules, where anything is possible because the normal constraints that prevent the impossible from occurring have somehow, for reasons we still don't understand, been suspended.